Butler, Pennsylvania revisited. The response is inadequate for sure. The latest, Biden did not individually approve blanket pardons done with the auto pen. Update on a Gaza plan. This is Dr. David D. Schein for Saving America with my own take on key stories from this past week focused on politics and business, and a super busy week it has been. Butler, Pennsylvania revisited. I regard the response as totally inadequate. The big headline this past week was that the Secret Service suspended without pay 6 agents for the security failures that resulted in the near assassination of President Trump. All Americans know that a bullet narrowly missed him, catching his earlobe. Sadly, a man there with his family was killed and 2 others seriously injured. Speaking from private industry, the discipline, if you can call it that, should have been within 10 days, not a year later. The private sector response would have been a host of terminations. In this case, suspensions without pay were for 10 to 42 days. I didn't hear of any terminations. Now, reportedly, on the return, they were placed in restricted duty roles with less operational responsibility. I regard this as meaningless. The deputy director of Secret Service saying the agency takes responsibility for the failure in Butler is also meaningless to me. And the family of the deceased and wounded, I saw a report that Joe Biden giving a speech about the same time was getting more protection than the former president, who was also the leading candidate to be reelected president. More details have been coming out of Washington that credible threat assessments for the Butler speech were available at least 10 days in advance. This was from a Government Accountability Office report released by Senator Chuck Grassley. No effort was made by the Secret Service to update the local police and to increase security on or move that rally indoors. The shooter was visible on the roof. In fact, I recently saw a video of him moving into that position on the roof. Worse, a pair of local police were aware of him but lacked the means or authority to pursue him. Frankly, this sounds like a continuation of the attack by the Washington deep state going back all the way to 2015. Trump is not one of the inner circle, and the power brokers are deliberately attempting to block Trump, and it goes from the Russia hoax to insufficient security. Remember, there was a second attempt to take Trump out at a golf course. This is anti-American conduct at its worst. It needs to be dealt with. The latest, Biden did not individually approve blanket pardons done with the auto pen. As I indicated in a previous Saving America, the Biden competency cover-up is the largest scandal in the U.S. government in 50 years. We are still picking around the edges. More recently, Biden doctor Kevin O'Connor took the Fifth Amendment when called before a congressional committee to explain about the president's mental status. He also allegedly covered up Biden's advanced prostate cancer. Generally, only guilty people take the Fifth, although, speaking as an attorney, for legal purposes, it cannot be viewed as an admission of guilt. Stacked on top of this, Joe Biden's so-called work husband, Anthony Bernal, also took the Fifth the next day. This nails the fraud being perpetrated on the American people, in my humble opinion. The committee will be interviewing others who were close to the center of the Biden White House. I am not sure what it will take to get the real goods. I call for immediate prosecution and long prison sentences for each and every fraudster that participated in this massive scam on the American people. Of course, Biden, despite his dilapidated mental status, is a key witness. In just the last week, he publicly admitted that he did not go through the pardons individual by individual before the auto pen was used. This is based on a report from the leftist New York Times. New information from various sources is now saying that the auto pen operator did not get instructions directly from Biden. It would seem that this disclosure alone would further document the scandal. Some of the convicts that Biden pardoned committed unthinkable crimes and should not be allowed near the rest of the American population. There are also the questionable political pardons, of course. I've taken the position that the presidential pardon power should not be unlimited. I would require Senate approval for each pardon in the future. This would at least provide a potential control valve for the people. I note that this is a bipartisan commentary, as I believe presidents of both parties have abused the presidential pardon privilege over the last 30 years. Reports on the economy are up and down. While a new Wall Street Journal poll of so-called experts are now saying there will not be a recession, they're not giving it a clean bill of health either. In the big picture, consumers are still spending, but the spending is a bit more restrained. Employment reports are fair. As I mentioned last week, the recent jobs report is not that big a deal since manufacturing jobs went down and public employment at state and local operations went way up. The threatened tariffs, with many in effect for months now, are producing income for the Fed, but without the increase in inflation predicted. However, the most recent inflation number is up 0.3% to 2.7%, so not a good trend. Remember, the target's 2%. The wholesale pricing is level, so that's a good note. Trump continues to call out Powell at the Fed for not lowering the Fed rate, but a conservative approach is for the Fed to watch the trend for a few more months before deciding on a drop in the rate. Trump also continues to call for Powell to resign, which I doubt will happen before the end of his term in May of 2026. An interesting number is the gross domestic product, or GDP, which grew 1% over year in the fourth quarter, increasing from the April forecast of just 0.8%. However, it's important to note that with the recent passage of the big tax bill, the politicians are calling for a GDP growth of 2.5% to avoid a huge increase in the national debt. The economists predict more like an annual rate of 1.9%, well below that. Hey, folks, in financing a car loan or a house loan, maybe 0.6% doesn't make a big difference. When you are dealing with trillions and trillions of dollars, we're talking about massive amounts of money. So it is important how well the economy does. Update on the Gaza plan. Unquestionably, one of the toughest issues on the world stage is resolving the long-running Gaza issue. I believe it is absolutely clear that there will not be a two-state solution. Anything that allows a self-governing operation there will become a Hamas stronghold again. After the horrors of October 7th, Israel and the U.S. are not going to allow that to happen. I credit reports from the Washington Free Beacon that provide some updates on the negotiations that are going on. A lot of the media is not covering this very well. Many recall that in early February, President Trump suggested the best path for Gaza would be to remove all the non-Hamas folks and turn Gaza into Riviera-type flashy development. Most laughed at the idea. In any event, no real development can happen in the ruin that was Gaza until most of the people are relocated. You just can't do a massive cleanup given the current circumstances. It's unfortunate. It's not humanitarian. Basically, it's terrible. The rub is that the neighboring countries have steadfastly resisted taking any of the roughly 2 million Gazans. Early talks are now being revealed with several countries, Sudan, Somalia, and Somaliland, about accepting the Gazans. A note includes that Somalia and Somaliland denied that any outreach occurred. I suspect that to do this, many dollars will need to be provided for resettlement and continued support. Not sure where those dollars would come from. In the meantime, slow progress is reported on the ceasefire negotiations between Hamas and Israel taking place in Doha. This is an effort to create a hostage release deal without Israel agreeing to accept the current situation. The status is unsettled as Hamas reps accuse Israel of bad faith, but the U.S. claims negotiations are continuing. Hamas obviously wants a deal that allows them to continue to exist. In other words, a permanent ceasefire with them remaining in control of parts of Gaza. I do not see that ever happening after October 7th. Is Mandami win in the New York City primary the result of huge numbers of illegals voting? While many are scratching their heads over the surprise win of a dirty commie, in my opinion, in the New York City Dem primary, I'm simply not surprised. How did that happen? Well, trace it back to the Dems' motor voter law from the 1993 Clinton administration, meaning if a person gets a driver's license, they can easily register to vote. But if they're not checking the citizenship for the driver's license, how can the state verify that the person is legally eligible to vote? Well, they can't, or up to now, certain states like New York and California just don't care. I believe this is called the law of unintended consequences. Hey, it's all fun and games until somebody gets hurt, right? It's too late for the New York City primary election, but states could implement a retroactive measure to require re-registration to vote by showing citizenship for their next voter registration. I also favor massive penalties, well promoted, of course, for voting if you are a non-citizen. New York also introduced in 2021 an insane law that requires various state agencies to automatically register people to vote. Well, then you have most likely non-citizens voting for the anti-American like Mamdani. Violence against ICE agents calls for harsher enforcement actions. In what sounds like third world dangers, ICE agents and other federal officers assisting in immigration enforcement have been targeted in 2 ambushes that took place in Texas recently. The Department of Justice listed 10 individuals charged in relation to the first incident when the suspects opened fire on correctional officers outside the Prairie Land Detention Center in Alvarado, Texas on the 4th of July. Sadly, one officer was shot in the neck, but fortunately will survive. The attack started with fireworks being shot at the facility. When the officers responded, apparently shots were fired. In addition, there was vandalism of official vehicles. A second incident was a man was killed after reportedly opening fire at a U.S. Border Patrol facility in McAllen, Texas, which is near the Mexican border. Ryan Luis Moscada, 27, was fatally shot after federal agents returned fire. He reportedly had an assault rifle and was carrying a utility vest at the time of the incident. Texas is openly supporting ISIS efforts, so these attacks in the state are especially notable. Enough is enough. Some really bad people are being detained by ICE and removed from our society. Anyone encouraging any interference with their efforts, politicians or civilians, must be dealt with harshly and quickly at the federal level. I want to call out Scumball, Massachusetts Federal District Court Judge Brian Murphy, who deliberately ignored a ruling by SCOTUS. The situation is that SCOTUS blocked an April ruling by Murphy in the case Department of Homeland Security versus DVD that prevented ICE from deporting illegals to a third country. Within hours, Murphy the clown, pretending to be a judge, issued an order stating that his related ruling enforcing the injunction remains in full force and effect, notwithstanding today's stay of the preliminary injunction. So the Department of Justice was back at SCOTUS with a petition that states Murphy's action was an unprecedented defiance of this court's authority. It further called his action a lawless act of defiance that once again disrupts sensitive diplomatic relations and slams the brakes on the executive's lawful efforts to effectuate third country removals. So SCOTUS held that Murphy is bound by the prior order and cannot enforce an injunction that our state rendered unenforceable. I call on Congress to initiate his impeachment as a judge immediately. Senate voted to end federal funding for Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is a bit sad for me since I got my real start in media at the UPenn public nonprofit FM radio station. That station was not receiving federal support. However, I then spent over 2 years on the PBS radio station in Philly, WHYY-FM. And I recall as a child watching Julia Child on Boston's public TV station, WGBH, as the French chef. Many have raised their kids with Sesame Street, and of course, the British mystery shows that occupy some great evening programming. However, this is part of a $1.1 billion in federal funding over the next 2 years for that operation. America is broke and time to cut optional costs. Further, there are some additional factors. The news program has been consistently far left for years. I view that as anti-American. A publicly funded media source can be nonpartisan, but it cannot be hard left. Further, PBS has been running ads for years. I thought the idea of public funding would be that there would be no ads. There is also hour after hour of fundraising and subscription solicitations. Therefore, I do believe that it is the right time to withdraw that federal funding. This is Dr. David D. Schein. Thanks for joining me for this special edition of Saving America. Remember, a new Saving America show is aired on the Brushwood Media Network every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Listen on any of the 16 network stations, Apple or Google mobile app, Apple CarPlay, TuneIn, Smart Speaker, and all smart TVs. Find more information at the brushwoodmedianetwork.com. Please be sure to join us each week. We welcome and love your feedback from our growing audience.